Thank you all for giving us some of your time on Wednesday midweek after work. I know that everybody's life is pretty hectic right now, and we appreciate you joining us for a conversation. I'll start off this sort of panel on drug decriminalization by recognizing on behalf of CSSDP and Law Students for Decriminalization. We are your two co-hosts. That the work we do is on Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, Stolo, Squamish, and Coast Salish land here in so-called Vancouver. And that the stolen land that surrounds us sustains our bodies and our work and our lives. This is the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and colonially occupied homeland of these peoples. To position myself, I am a grateful and uninvited visitor here. A biracial settler immigrant born in Amiskwaci, traditional land of the Cree, Blackfoot, Nakota Sioux, Dene, Saulteaux, Métis Nation, and several others. And for me and those of us who are also not Indigenous to these lands, our being here is an ongoing act of violent colonization. For those of us especially that do work within law and within drug policy, we are the products, symptoms, and tools of violent capitalism and colonialism. And our livelihoods revolve around systems that are central to upholding anti-Blackness, anti-Indigeneity, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, gender and sex discrimination, and classism. As such, we sit in positions of profound privilege and power, and we are therefore just as profoundly obligated to stand in solidarity with the movements for Indigenous sovereignty, land back, and decolonization. Part of that process, a small part of that process, means taking the time to reflect on how we engage with the land around us. Now, I think people more often do that for the land that they're physically on. But since the pandemic, I've been thinking a lot about land and how it exists within and without the online world that our society has been sustained by over the last few years. I think about where we even start in recognizing the lands and the peoples impacted by the land violence of technological infrastructure that we often take for granted. I think about how we are accountable, and I am accountable to the Ohlone family of peoples, a collective of about 50 separate tribes that have been living in the Bay Area for about 10,000 years, and who are the traditional stewards of so-called San Jose, California, where Zoom's head office is. I think about the many peoples whose lands data servers occupy and disrupt. And I think about the land that energy farms, even sustainable energy farms, take up in order to sustain the infrastructure that we use. So this is a call to commit to thinking about your own relationship to the land where you're joining us from, to think about your positionality, to think about who you stand in solidarity with, and more importantly, how you take actions to stand in that solidarity. We thank you for coming to our panel today on drug decriminalization. This panel brings together a number of local advocates to talk about their experiences and their perspectives on drug decriminalization. My name is Quinn, I use he, him pronouns, and I am the co-chair of the Law Students for Decriminalization and Harm Reduction with Maren Hergert, who's also on this in this event. We are a social justice oriented group of UBC law students who are passionate about the rights and well-being of people who use drugs and people who do sex work. We fondly refer to ourselves as Decrim because our actual name is super long. And we advocate and organize events and campaigns in an effort to reduce the stigma around drug use and sex work, and to educate our law student community and the broader community at large when we can on evidence-based policy and the real-world impact of laws and regulations that are often taught to us in a really sterile way. And I'll give it over to...
My name is Samara, and I'm the chair of the Vancouver chapter of the Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy. So just a quick overview for those unfamiliar with our group. CSSDP is part of a national network of students and other young adults who are concerned about the negative impact our drug policies have on individuals, families, and communities, and we advocate for legal reform and appropriate evidence-based responses to prevent and reduce harm from drug prohibition. We mobilize and empower young people and students to participate in the political process, pushing for sensible policies to achieve a safer and more just future while fighting back against counterproductive drug policies, particularly those that harm students and youth. So now we're really excited to introduce our moderator, Meenakshi Mano. Meenakshi is a criminalization and policing campaigner at Pivot Legal Society. She's also a member of Vancouver Prison Justice Day Committee and the Defund 604 Network. She believes that the fight for decriminalization and harm reduction must center the communities most targeted by colonialism, white supremacy, police, and prisons. And locally, Meenakshi is inspired by the work of local groups like DULF, Vandu, Wars, and Joint Effort. So now we'd like to turn it over to Meenakshi, and thank you so much for moderating this panel.
Thank you so much to Quinn and Samara for their opening comments, and really appreciating how Quinn grounded us all in a territorial acknowledgement. Like some of you, I'm joining from the unceded, unsurrendered, and sovereign territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and giving thanks and honoring the continued work they do to uphold their sovereignty on these territories amidst colonial genocide. Yeah, and also holding space for the heaviness that people might be carrying with, continued announcements of confirmations of mass graves. So yeah, just really recognizing that it's a heavy time for folks. As mentioned, my name is Meenakshi, and I'm moderating tonight's panel. It's a treat. It's like 4 people who I love and respect and cherish. So it's a real honor to be asked to do this. I'm gonna briefly introduce each of the panelists. And I also want to invite folks who are joining from elsewhere to share in the chat whose territories you're joining from, what groups you might be a part of, what's your favorite spaghetti, anything that you want to tell us. So we've got a couple of guiding questions for tonight, but also invite folks to share things that come up for them. Again, like as the moderator, I'm exercising some privilege and control over what gets advanced, but if you feel like your really burning question didn't get addressed, feel free to hit up the organizers or myself afterwards, and we can try to answer your question if we've got time. And a reminder that people can make use of the chat, but if you are not being respectful, you'll get in Zoom trouble, whatever that looks like. So I'm gonna now just shortly introduce everyone who's here, and then we're gonna be in this panel. And again, thanks for coming out tonight and sharing a little bit of your Wednesday with us. So right at the top of my screen, I see Delilah Gregg. Delilah is a carrier woman and a member of the Nak'adsli First Nation. She's a mother to 1 son. She's been living in Vancouver for more than 50 years. And she's also a Vandu member, sits on the board of directors there, and is also the vice president of WARS, the Western Aboriginal Harm Reduction Society. Delilah is a tireless frontline harm reduction worker. I don't know how many jobs she has, but I think she's been at least 3 of them today alone. And just a quick quote that Delilah believes that people who stigmatize substance use must stop and accept people as they are. And she's working towards a world where people are always treated with compassion and support. So, hi, Delilah. The next person I'm going to introduce is Jeremy Calicum from DULF, creators of this awesome hoodie that you can find at heroinmart.com. Jeremy is a public health student, activist, and organizer. And for over 5 years, he's been pushing for real solutions to the overdose crisis, including an unsanctioned overdose prevention site in Nanaimo, BC, organizing BC's provincial drug user network, and working as a drug checking technician, and now organizing with the Drug User Liberation Front, also known as DULF. So hi, Jeremy, thanks for joining us tonight. Next, I see Caitlin Shane. Caitlin Shane is one of my lovely coworkers and a staff lawyer at Pivot. She's the drug policy lawyer here and takes direction from drug user-led movements and advocates for liberation, decriminalization, and the legal regulation of all drugs. Caitlin's been working in the downtown east side since 2010 as an outreach worker, providing frontline services in so-called Vancouver and Victoria. And finally, my friend Vince Tao. Hi, Vince. Hi, Caitlin. Caitlin, you didn't get to do a wave. Give everyone a wave. Thank you. Vince Tao is a community organizer at VANDU, the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users. And prior to this, he worked as a labor organizer at the Teaching Support Staff Union at SFU and as a librarian in Vancouver's Chinatown. And Vince also serves on the steering committee of the Vancouver Tenants Union. So welcome, Vince. So I'm going to start with one of the opening questions here, and I'm going to put it to, I don't know, I'm going to put it to Delilah to open with this. So first question from folks who were organizing is, what is drug decriminalization, and how does that relate to legalization, prohibition, or safe supply? So if you just want to share, what does decriminalization mean to you?
It means the cops stop harassing the people, you know, that are trying to survive every day. Even if they've got a really tiny amount or just some of their personal. Sorry, I just had a brain fart there. I just a little thrown off. Sorry I'm late. Just a little thrown off by this small room and just me in here and my tech person over there. Sorry. Yeah, it just means the cops, you know, got to stop harassing the people, right? I'm not sure what else to say. Sorry, I'm just kind of thrown off a little bit, so I'll get better.
That's a perfect answer and really summarizes some of the biggest themes around the harms of criminalization. And I know you're a pro, you'll find your footing. Jeremy, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, you know, we really need to look at decriminalization in context of, you know, how policy change usually happens. And at least from my perspective, decriminalization is, you know, this kind of incrementalist step towards, you know, legalization and liberation of people who use drugs. And what real liberation would be is legalization of substances like we see with, you know, cannabis and alcohol. I think what we will see with decriminalization, what that really means is taking away the kind of criminal aspects of, you know, substance use, so that people aren't going to be, you know, criminally charged for having substances. But, you know, I think as far as I understand, fines and, you know, harassment and kind of these coercive policies will still be in play. So you're still looking at marginalization of, you know, people who use substances and the kind of intersectional aspects that come into play there as well. So I think decriminalization is just this, you know, logical kind of step in incrementalism, but in the context of a, you know, public health emergency, it's a really inappropriate response, especially if it's not integrated with something like safe supply, because there's still no sort of works that come into kind of alleviating the problems that we're seeing with the toxic drug supply.
I can just add to that. Yeah, I mean, Delilah said it perfectly. It's like, it is about removing the impact of police with respect to possessing drugs. The problem, among many problems with decriminalization, is it's a slippery policy. And so long as we have a state that is deeply invested in prohibition, we can say we have decriminalization, but police will continue to jack people up. They'll continue to punish people for possessing drugs, even if it's kind of not formally recorded. And we often see as well with decriminalization policies, just taking away a criminal regime and replacing it with an administrative one. So still continuing to punish people and perpetuating the harms of criminalization, but doing it through fines and harassment and coercive medicalization.
May I? Yeah. So this might be a little bit of a long answer because I want to tell the story of the Vancouver model of decriminalization. Is it appropriate to talk about that now, Menashe, you think? Because I agree completely with Delilah. It should decriminalization just cops out of our pockets, right? Out of the pockets of the people on the street. That's what it should mean, right? And you're talking about decrim. It's like it's hot on people's lips right now. There's places all across North America that are, considering decriminalization, but really this is something that the devil is in the details, right? And that's what we learned at Bandu. As you may have heard, Mayor Kennedy Stewart in November 2020 announced this progressive city council is considering, putting in an exemption with Health Canada to decriminalize small possession of drugs in Vancouver, right? And it was a bold step to stop the drug crisis, so on and so forth. And he said, also note this, that drug users would be consulted all the way through, right? I think Garth from Crackdown has a recording of him saying that, right? And so it comes, so here's a short little timeline. So November 2020, he says that. December 2020, he has like a small mayor's panel where people with lived experience, a lot of our members at Bandu and Wars are able to talk to the mayor for about like 5 minutes to like consult him on this policy. And then months later, we don't hear anything until around April 2021, right? And we get like an email from like some city admin person who's like, oh, we'd like to have a meeting with you. And we say, sure, let's talk about this. We haven't heard about your decriminalization plans for a long time. Note that right when this was announced, Caitlin and Bandu and Pivot, we released a statement saying, great, finally, we have been working on pushing for decriminalization for decades. It's really great that you've taken about 25 years to actually consider it. But we also said, we want decriminalization with no punitive measures, no diversion, no thresholds, meaning there's no kind of like bottom cap for what criminalization means. We want it all gone, as Delilah said, no more cops in our pockets, right? And so fast forward again, back to April, we don't hear anything from the city for months. And then suddenly they're like, okay, let's meet. They wanted to meet us on a Thursday. On a Tuesday, on one of our regular, Bandu has these education groups that happens every week for the last 25 years of doing that. We look at the news and we see, hey, Andrea Wu has reported that the city has already submitted its first draft proposal of its decriminalization plan. And what did they do? They put in thresholds and they put in some numbers too with the thresholds. So we looked at the schedule and it's like per drug, and I don't remember the actual numbers. I think it was 2 grams of down, 1 gram of meth, 1.5 of crack cocaine, and 3 of powder. And so we looked at that and they said, okay, the city says that this is 3 days worth of drug use, right, for an average user. We put them up on a wall, right, and we looked at them at Tuesday group and we said, does this look like 3 days use? And Kevin, who is the our vice president at Bandu, he looked at that and laughed and said, that's breakfast for me. And everyone in the room started laughing because they said, this doesn't look at all like 3 days use, right? This is 1 day use at tops, but it was completely unrealistic. And that's when we started to get a clue that this policy for decriminalization wasn't for us. It wasn't for the users on the street. It was for someone else. It was for the media. It was for the mayor to look good. It was for the cops to look good. And it was for some researchers to make a few dollars on consultancies, but it really, really had nothing to do with the reality of what's going on the ground at Bandu. I'll stop the story there, but I could go back into it in another round of questions. But I think that should paint a picture as to what decriminalization really, you really need to take it apart, right? Because it comes around as a slogan and as an incremental step, as Jeremy said. But when you actually pull it apart and look at one, what's actually in the policy, and 2, who's behind it, right? And who actually has a say in creating the policy, that's what really matters here, right? And the last thing I'll say before I move on is that when we got to that meeting, right, we were pretty pissed. So it was actually a wonderful scene because Caitlin was there taking notes. And it was like, and I think Delbert, you were there. It was like a whole hour of us screaming at the city people, just be like, are you guys morons? Like, what have you done here? Like, this has nothing to do with our lives. And you have not consulted us at all. And when we asked them, was there a single person with lived experience, a single drug user in your decriminalization working group? They said no. For months, they were working on this policy, and there's not a single person with experience of using drugs on that panel, right? And that's where you know exactly. It's like it's a scam, this folks. Like this whole thing. Like if you create policy about drug users without drug users' input, it's bullshit, right? And that's why always we return to Bandu's, our mandate is nothing about us without us, right? Is
Thank
that
you,
drug
Ben.
users have
I'm
to.
gonna just kind of take it back to the group. So yeah, I guess like I think one thing that this initial round of questions kind of shed light on is we talk a lot about decriminalization and what that means, but Delilah, I'm wondering if you can shed a little bit of light on like what the reality of criminalization means for folks, like, because I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand the scope and the scale of how policing is interfering with drug user-led organizing. So can you just kind of give us a little glimpse of like the kind of activities you see the police undertaking in your community?
Right, and I'm only going to maybe mention this much. Yeah, the fact that they sit in front of a place where people need to get their medicine, so to speak, and they can't even go there because the police are sitting out front, and it stops the people from coming in to get well. It's not so much as maybe not really wanted by the police, but I mean, they might have issues with the police, right? And they feel intimidated. Then they got to go to the back alleys, right? And God forbid, and hopefully they don't die while they're back there trying to use and trying to get well, because they can't come inside because there's cops sitting outside. And it's a sad reality, and I really wish it was different, right? I mean, I've lived, in the Lower Mainland in this area, like for a long time, and I've seen so much cops down here than I've seen like anywhere else, it seems like, right? And I wish it wasn't so, and I was talking to somebody one day and I said, I wonder what it would be like if we didn't have cops. And they said, oh, in a way we kind of need them. I said, I really wish we didn't, right? But yeah, it's fuckery, total fuckery, right? And it really sucks that we have to put up with this shit because we're a bunch of good people. We've made bad choices, right? But we are good people, most of us. And we're just trying to get well and survive, and because we've had so much trauma in our life. And yeah, and in order to find happiness, if you could, what was it he said? If you can't find happiness within, you go outside of yourself, right? And a lot of people don't know how to do that or have never been shown that. So they turn to drugs or some other form of addiction, which is not always drugs. It could be shopping, it could be sex, it could be cooking, it could be working, who knows, right? But it's when you step outside of yourself to make yourself happy.
Thanks for that, Delilah. And I think what you're highlighting really illustrates like the impact of stigma, because certain ways of having euphoric experiences are stigmatized, whereas others aren't. And I'm wondering if other folks want to speak to the impact of drug use stigma and how it's shaping decriminalization.
Yeah, and not to downplay the role that stigma does play in kind of these personal sort of interactions that are had, but I think the way that stigma has been kind of used, I think it's been kind of co-opted in terms of in the realm of policy development and the way that it's being used by these institutions. I mean, we're seeing like these signs all over DC of like let's break down the stigma, like drug users are people too. And I think we really need to highlight, like, I don't think, maybe I'm wrong here, but I don't think the issue is that people don't see people who use drugs as people. I mean, the real kind of block that stigma is this kind of institutional stigma against people, and the stigma that's grounded in policy. That's the real issue here. And one of the things that I think really kind of highlights this is when I was part of running the provincial peer network, or a group that got $1 million to fund drug user groups throughout the province. That money was ripped away after 1 year from people who use drugs to be able to manage their own funds. And I think when stigma really comes down to it, it's just institutional kind of practice where it's the kind of taking away of autonomy from people who are marginalized. And if you really want to break down stigma, it's giving people autonomy, and that plays out in personal relationships as well as relationships with institutions. And I think that's really the way to critically look at how stigma is being used.
Yeah, if I can build off of what Jeremy said, I agree. There's a real emphasis at government levels around destigmatizing, and that focus reinforces stigma as like this locus of all issues. And really it's about power and money and control. And so, if we were really cared about people and like wanted to shift the program, then we would actually start investing in people who use drugs and divesting from police and like completely shifting the distribution of capital and power in society. So I think, people like to talk about stigma and destigmatizing because it's something palatable and it's attractive to people to talk about, and especially people in government, because what does it even really mean? It's very sort of like abstract and sounds good. But at the end of the day, if you're not willing to actually structurally change things, then fuck, like what is it for?
Thanks for that, Caitlin. I think stigma also ties into the example that Vince was sharing at the beginning around this provincial Decrim advisory that actually didn't meaningfully involve people who use drugs and certainly didn't give them any real decision-making power. So Vince, I'm wondering if you could speak a bit to stigma and how it actually plays out through these kind of structural pieces.
Yeah. So city staff, they're very good at destigmatizing by like pretending that they care about you when they talk to you over Zoom. But beyond that, actually having the power to change policy and shape society, again, drug users are completely excluded, right? And of course, that's exactly why we, when this Vancouver model was coming about, even though we do believe that, it's a step, again, drug users are completely excluded from the process of actually developing the thing. And we after weeks of pushing the city, we realized it was the cops in the end, right? That were deciding every single part of the policy, right? It was Chief Palmer all the way at the end, his big shiny head. He was the one pulling all the strings here, right? And that he had the final word as well. We marched on the streets. We had allies come out and say, this is a bullshit model. We had drug users, drug advocates. We had people on the street. We marched out with our Trojan horse, as we called it. Or as Delilah would call it, the Trojan moose, because we saw that this policy, if made by the wrong hands, there's a lot of traps on the inside, right? And Caitlin has already talked about this in terms of what this could lead to if it's done wrong, which was expanding police powers to search, right? Arming police with scales, right? To be more thorough about who's a criminal and who's not, according to by gram, by milligram, how much you have in your pocket. Just a little bit over the threshold, you're a criminal. But I also want to say one more thing is that, like, as Caitlin said, like the cops, they've been trained since like their weird little cadet teenage years to hate poor people and to hate drug users, right? So no policy, no like little like package of like, here's what you should do now is going to change that overnight. And that's the real effect of stigma. What Delilah was talking about, the presence of police is what kills people. It's not even, the bullets or the batons. It's really when a cop is sitting outside of our space, right? People don't go and they use in the alleyways, exactly like Delilah said, and people die. That's the real effect of stigma, right? It's not this like floopy thing where it's like we're nicer to each other on Zoom, but rather it's like the real power, right? And the power over life.
Thanks, Vince. So I know that a lot of what we've talked about so far is policing and the people and systems that hold them up. Yeah, so let's talk about the medical system, which I think is totally integrated with how drug users are subject to forces of criminalization. Thank you, Arlo, for this segue. I'm wondering, again, back to you, Delilah, if you could talk about maybe even again, just sketch out like, what are your experiences of trying to navigate the medical system? And like, do you think that doctors understand stigma particularly well?
Yeah, I've not actually had any issues with the doctor or anything like that. Mind you, my doctor's not in this area, but she knows everything about me and all that I do. But I wish a lot more doctors were more open like she is. And it's really sad that, just because of our zip code and where we live, that people are stigmatized and all that, especially when they go to St. Paul's. If you request by an ambulance, you want to go to BGH, they'll always take you to St. Paul's. Right. And if I'm not mistaken, St. Paul's is a Catholic hospital, I believe. And a lot of people are still dealing with residential school and the way they were treated and all that. And it's really sad that people can't see. Sure, we're different on the outside, but we're all the same on, like, we all bleed red, It's really, it makes me frustrated when people are treated differently just because if they don't have money or their zip code where they live, their area code.
And
There was a paper that was done with the late Tracy Morrison, rest in peace, my sister from another mister. But they did a paper and they treated me bad because I was Native, and that had to do with St. Paul's, and apparently it's in the medical journal. So, and I think we've got a copy or a couple copies at the office, and I think I have one stashed away somewhere.
I'm glad you still have that piece of her work. When you say St. Paul's, like, to me that means something, but do you want to explain to folks who aren't necessarily joining from Vancouver, like, what exactly is St. Paul's and why do people not want to go there?
Well, it's a hospital that's in the downtown core, I guess, like around the Burrard, if you know Vancouver at all, Burrard and Davie area. And it's an old hospital. They're actually building a new one over by the main SkyTrain station and behind there. And it's a Catholic hospital, means there's used a lot of Catholicism, or has to do with a lot of Catholic stuff, right? The churches and all that. Used to be a lot of nuns that were working in there. That's to my understanding of how it used to be and all that. But yeah, I'm not sure if I'm explaining. Like, VGH is so different from St. Paul's, right?
Yeah, thanks, Delilah. I think, like, again, seeing that people are joining from across so-called Canada, like, every city has a St. Paul's, right? It has a notorious hospital where people don't want to go there. They know that they're going to get substandard care. They're going to get treated a certain way. They're going to get a security guard following them through. Like, and I think that builds into the next question, which is, we're hearing a lot about safe supply. And I think the model that we're really seeing from government is a medical model that involves doctors. And what role should doctors play in safe supply, if any? And I'm going to start with Jeremy from Delft, because I know you've done a lot of work on this.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, a big thing with Delft and the whole model that we've been pushing in, very close collaboration with Vandu and other drug user groups across BC, is that, mandating or requiring people who use drugs to engage with the medical system is, a type of stigma in itself, right? I mean, it's pretty much, outright saying, like, you're sick and you need help because you need drugs and you shouldn't use drugs. And, for a lot of people, for most people, that's not the case. And it's certainly not the government's place to, tell somebody whether or not they should be using substances. So what we've pushed for and what we continue to push for is a kind of model where you can use drugs and there's no implications that you have to engage with the medical system. You should be able to get your substances, use your substances, mind your own business, engage with other people who use substances, build community, and create safety and support, and improve your health that way in ways that you see fit, as well as your community. And that's really what kind of looping back to that whole stigma thing about empowering people is making sure that they have the autonomy to be able to do that and stay safe. And, not just that, but there's also, like solid research that says when you begin to integrate medical aspects into harm reduction services, if you want to call it that, but the same thing goes for compassion clubs. Like as you begin to increase medicalization of these services, people are less likely to engage, and it decreases the effectiveness of the whole program. And ultimately we got to think about what we want as a society. I mean, it's very clear what people who use substances and advocates want. They want a complete sort of washout of the medical system from safe supply. But as a society, what we want to think is like, what do we really want as well? And we want people to not die, so we want people to engage in these programs that are going to keep them safe, and we also want them to live happy and like productive lives. Like we want them people to be engaged in society, and shoving people into the medical system doesn't do that. So it's very important that as we begin to develop these sort of policy initiatives or programs, that we ensure they're non-carceral and non-medical, and that they're just simply there to help and empower people. And that's the most important thing we can do.
Thanks, Jeremy. Vince or Caitlin, I'm wondering if you also want to speak a bit to the role of doctors or even like regulatory bodies in safe supply and what you see happening, and blockages they're creating.
Well, the College of Physicians, the College of Pharmacists, these are cartels, folks. they're cops in white coats. And any member from Bandu, and especially BC APOM, can tell you, right, is that they don't want to engage in a program where, yes, like in order to get the medication they need to live, they have to show up at certain times in a day, multiple times, pee in a cup, get a guy to watch them, in order to just go on for the next couple of hours, right? And as Jeremy was saying, we need a real safe supply that's right onto the streets and controlled by the community, because we know best, right? And there's a lot of law students in here. I know you guys like Latin. There's a good question to ask always is, qui prodest, like who stands to gain from this? And you do a little bit of digging. Every time a pharmacist like watches a guy pee to like take a pill, they get a little bit of money, right? They get a little bit of money, and that's exactly why they're like not gonna move on all of this stuff. Is because one is like the money, right? That's a big piece of it. But two is power, right? These guys have PhDs. They have all these like certificates on the back of behind their walls and stuff. They don't want to give up that power of like, I am the one, I'm dad, I get to choose whether or not you get medicine today. And as such, that kind of like completely arbitrary power that pharmacists and doctors hold over people, especially poor people, that's something they never want to give up, right? And that's why we continue to struggle against them for a real safe supply. If you think about even the little bit of safe supply that they started giving out at the start of COVID, the dilly pills, the patches, which are still pretty hard to get, right? We all of a sudden, a few months in, people are like, getting their dillies, getting their Dilaudids, and suddenly, for no reason at all, the pharmacist will cut you off from it, right? And this life-saving thing that finally you can walk away with in your pocket some of the medication you need. They're like arbitrarily, nah, actually, we're gonna take that away from you. No explanation, right? And this is what happens. This is the reality of a medicalized safe supply, is that it's completely at the whim of the cartels of the College of Pharmacists, College of Physicians, with no explanation other than they want to hoard the money and the power. It's quite simple.
Thanks for that, Vince. And I really appreciate the framing of these bodies as cartels, because I think it also refocuses us. A lot of drug war stigma focuses on cartels in the global south and the harm that they're doing, but we have these homegrown, highly professionalized bodies that are absolutely profiting off of drug users every which way. Caitlin, I'm wondering if you have anything you want to share around the medicalization.
Yeah, I was just going to say, kind of building off of what Vince said, it's really no coincidence that we're seeing a public health lens or a medical model replace or kind of move in to cover the tracks of the criminalization model. We see this in every context. It's not just drug policy. You know, you look at disability justice, it's the same thing. We go from one model to the next. And the question at the root of it is exactly who stands to gain. Medicalization is, you know, it's the perfect option for people in power because it allows for a continued maintenance, tamping down control of people who use drugs. It allows for money to stay in the same pockets. It even has a perfect opportunity for police to turn themselves into mental health workers or healthcare providers, right? Like it's so seamless. It's really not that big of a stretch to move from criminalization to medicalization. They're virtually one and the same. And someone in the chat, Avery, I think, made a really great comment. And just sort of the way in which people get lost, not just in incarceration, but also the medical system. There are places where people are sort of banished to, and there's no other social supports for people. And that's exactly how it was designed to be. That's all I would say.
Thanks, Caitlin. I just noted after we all went on a tirade about the medical system, yes, this will be recorded, and I believe CSSDP folks will be making it available. I want to just draw together a couple of threads that I'm seeing in the chat, and I think they relate to the way folks who use drugs and folks who are psychiatric survivors are navigating these systems. So I'm seeing someone here talk about being flagged and not being able to get access to the medication that they need through the like typical medical channels, paramedics who are also stigmatizing them through inadequate treatment. There's another great point here about residential school survivors and how First Nations people, like there's no system to catch you if you get lost in these kind of dangerous scenes like the medical system or incarceration. So thank you to folks who are bringing up those points, because I think folks who have been psychiatrized and institutionalized are dealing with another layer, right? If we think about this through like an intersectional approach, there's the policing on the street, there's the policing through the medical system, and there's the policing that actually enables you to be held without consent in a facility like a hospital and treated against your will. And all of those intersect when folks are dealing with mental health issues and again, used against people basically to deprive them of autonomy in a very real material way. I want to talk a little bit now about the illicit drug supply, kind of shift towards like this non-medical model that's being advanced by folks like Dolph and Van Du. So I'm wondering, and I'm going to start with Jeremy here, how do we work towards destigmatizing fentanyl and other non-pharmaceutical drugs? So we heard Vince talk a little bit about the safe supply regime that rolled out at the beginning of COVID, but what I hear Dolph talking about is a little bit different. So can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, I think, you know, as we push for safe supply, we have to do it in a strategic way, because, you know, realizing which arenas we're really kind of fighting for this in, it really ends up being the, you know, arena of public perception. And, you know, doing these protests and kind of really big displays or stunts, you know, helps bring people in and start these conversations. And, you know, of course, what Dolph started with was giving out free heroin, cocaine, and meth. But, you know, what we always knew, and what we've, you know, continued to hear from, you know, people who are using these substances is that, you know, they are going, like, fentanyl is going to need to be a part of safe supply, and it's going to be an integral part, especially as you start to, you know, think of, you know, the kind of impacts that criminalization and prohibition have already had on the supply, and that, you know, people are already using fentanyl, and it's been like a really kind of logical progression of the supply in terms of, value, like kind of that you can get from your substances, and potency, right? Like fentanyl is a lot more potent, and the fact is that some people use and will continue to use fentanyl. We need a safe supply of all of these drugs. So I think it's really important that we continue to push for these substances in the whatever kind of safe supply initiatives that we're going to get. But it's really difficult because we need to navigate public perception in the kind of public realm. Fentanyl has been painted as the bad, like the bad drug, right? Like fentanyl, they paint fentanyl as the killer, but it's fentanyl is not the killer. It's unpredictability of the supply that's the killer. People can use fentanyl safely and do in medicalized contexts because they know how strong it is. And the current drug checking technologies that we have don't help with that at all. They don't tell you how strong your dope is, except with the one exception of substance using their kind of tandem mass spec that can tell you how strong your dope is. But other than that, like you're left guessing, and that's the real problem. But if we have a reliable supply of fentanyl, people can and will use it safely.
Thanks for that. And I think what you're pointing out, Jeremy, is that fentanyl is not the bad guy. Prohibition is. Prohibition is what is killing people, and using whatever drug du jour to stand in and try to put people away for life sentences for trafficking it is really just distracting folks from the crisis of a contaminated supply. So thinking about the giveaways and the handouts that DELF has organized and DELF and Mandu have participated in, Delilah, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about the impact of that giveaway of safe supply led by peers. Like when it's happened in your community, how do folks feel afterwards?
Had a lot of, had a lot of people want to know when was the next one. But on the other end of it, people were getting mad because they didn't know where's my free drugs, and they weren't on a list, and how do I get on the list? So that was the first one, basically. Was the first or the second one. But the last one before this most recent, yeah, the lineups were long. People didn't get what they needed or wanted. People were getting mad. But the last one we had, yeah, it went pretty well. It was a little bit more structured and all that, and people were pretty good. I don't really recall people getting all upset. Where's my free drugs? How come I didn't? Like a couple did, but not very many. Yeah, just a lot of it has to go with planning, and learning from what we've done last time. And yeah, I think, yeah.
What has worked well in those handouts?
The structure, more communication, I think, and just knowing where people were at and all that, like, and having a list of people. And we learn every time we do one, right, what we can do better next time, or what worked and what didn't work, and we tweak out the little bit of issues that we're having. And every time we're going to get better and better, I think, as long as we're open to it, and we have pretty decent communication, planning well ahead, and everybody being on the same ball kind of thing. Is just my outlook on it, right?
Yeah, thank you for that. And, recognizing that there's just not like there's insufficient supply for folks, right? Like people are not getting adequate treatment and access to medication through this medical model. And then it's, honestly, 6 years into a crisis, it's a bit disturbing that like a scrappy group of folks are the ones who are leading policy. But of course, that's the way it is, because you're the closest to the problem and you know what's actually going to work. Dylan M wants to know, were dealers pissed off about it? And I'm assuming when you say dealer, you mean doctors, or yeah, feel free to clarify in the chat. But yeah, Vince, go ahead.
Yeah, just to support that a bit, is that we actually had some of the dealers that like hang out outside Bandu. They were lining up with us, right? And they were like excited and happy. And I think Delilah's right. It was a, you know, we've done it like last year was like the year of safe supply actions led by DELF. And I think over several events, several actions, DELF and Vandu had kind of built up step by step, like a structure. Like this is actually how policy, if you want to call it, that's a really boring name for it. But this is actually how life-saving alternatives to the current horrible system are built, are through making mistakes, but also the courage and bravery to do something necessary, absolutely necessary, right? As Eris Nix, who I'm pretty sure she's in the room somewhere still, would say, by any means necessary. So the first few times, yeah, it was kind of messy, but by August 31st on International Overdose Awareness Day, it was a slick machine, right? And the members were running it. We had a nice barbecue and music playing outside. People were happy, and you know, we had follow-ups too, and people were coming back to us saying they did not OD and they liked the drugs. They did also say, hey, it's not fent, because a lot of folks coming into the streets right now, they've never done heroin in their life. It's not around anymore, right? If they go straight to the streets, it's all fent. But they tried the heroin and they said, yeah, you know, it's not as strong as the stuff I get on the streets, but I don't wake up the next day feeling horrible. And I could see myself, if I got this for free regularly and I could, you know, control when I could get it, I would definitely choose that, right? That was resoundingly what everyone was saying when they came back to us, right? And I think that this is exactly what we need to continue to do, is to dare to try these things that the state is reluctant to or refuses to do in order to save those lives, right? And we need to just keep pushing and trying and experimenting, because that's all we're asking for, is a chance to try something different, because nothing else is working, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point, that no real tangible drug policy change has happened without you know, the community taking action first and showing the state, the policymakers, how it's done. I mean, I think it was, you know, Vandu pushed the envelope on most of the drug policy change, and made Vancouver the mecca of harm reduction that it is, with supervised consumption sites. Pretty sure BC APOM was pushing getting methadone to people, and I'm pretty sure Vandu played a big role in getting naloxone out to people. And it's just, you know, time and time again, and it's going to continue to happen. So, you know, it's going to be a long fight, but it's great that there's people willing to fight.
Thanks, Jeremy. Caitlin, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add, I think, you know, we have to also acknowledge, like, every time people are doing these actions and organizing these events, they're putting their liberty at risk, because there are police who want to crack down on people that are doing these actions to save lives. Yes, that is how policy has always moved in Vancouver and everywhere, is like people doing that. But it's just like, it's ridiculous that not only is it on us, is it on the people to take matters into our own hands, but we also have to do so at risk of incarceration. It's just completely absurd. So yeah, that was all I was going to add.
Thanks. Since we are kind of edging policy talk, we may as well bite the bullet and talk about the City of Vancouver's application for Section 56 exemption versus DELF's application. And Caitlin, maybe I'll just start with you. Can you briefly sketch out what is this Section 56 exemption and what's the point of it?
Sure. So basically, the Federal Minister of Health has a power that allows her to exempt any person or group of people from any law or any provision of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. So historically, we've seen supervised injection sites exist because those spaces, people who are in those spaces, are exempted from possession charges. Vancouver applied last year in May for a citywide exemption so that most people in Vancouver would not face criminal repercussions for possessing drugs. But of course, it's not quite so simple. Vancouver imposed all sorts of caveats that we discussed earlier. And basically, it's a situation where, there are like these small threshold quantities of substances that if this exemption request is even approved, we don't know that it will be, and it may not be approved by the Minister of Health. But if it were, people would be allowed to possess 2 grams of opioids, 3 grams of cocaine, 10 rocks of crack cocaine, et cetera, et cetera. So very small amounts that isn't going to work for many, many people. But that's the idea behind the exemption, is that it would encompass all adults in Vancouver who possess certain quantities of certain substances.
Thanks, Caitlin. Just a quick question that I think would be useful from the chat is, are these exemptions only for inside a space, or does it encompass an area surrounding a site?
It totally depends on the exemption. So the exemption power is quite flexible. In the context of supervised consumption sites, the exemption applies to people within that building. But in Vancouver's exemption request, it's a geographic area exemption. So it would be all of Vancouver, except, unless the minister was to say, except not within X number of miles from school or a playground or whatever. So it totally depends on the exemption.
Thanks for that. So Jeremy, can you give folks a little bit of an overview of what Delft's application for the exemption looks like?
Sure. I mean, I think, starting from the Vancouver application is that, it's just for people to possess substances, and it does nothing for people to actually procure what they need to use. So, logically, I mean, the logic follows that the supply will stay as is, and maybe go one way or the other. It's hard to say. I mean, I would hazard that it may even get, worse as police redirect their efforts to, the supply chain, and those incentives to, move towards more potent substances, continues to build. So what the DOLF application does is it addresses that safe supply component, saying, like, decriminalization or not, people need a reliable place where they can get their drugs, where they know what's in it, how strong it is, and they have a consistent supply of it. And to take away that sort of, so that, people have a place that's accountable, so they aren't kind of preyed upon, by nefarious sort of actors to, squeeze out money or whatever, so that they can go somewhere, get their drugs at cost that they know are clean. So it's all about safe supply. So people can get clean drugs and not be, at risk of being arrested for having those substances. So the things that we asked for in our, the DOLF application were that we were able to access a reliable supply, either from a pharmaceutical producer, which is the, preference, or if that's, off the table for some odd reason, then we would, source it from, community or online, and, kind of secure those lines. And then people that are accessing the club would also, be exempt for, possessing and purchasing those substances and having them. So it'd be the exemptions for the clubs and for the people who'd be accessing the clubs to have their substances. That's what we're asking for. And that's a lot different than just, decriminalization, because it actually addresses what's causing the deaths.
Thank you for that. Delilah, over to you. I wonder if you could speak about what a compassion club would mean for yourself and folks at Van Duer Wars.
Just like what Jeremy was saying, that would be a place to go to get a safe supply where, people aren't gonna get ripped off, so to speak. They're gonna know what they're getting, and they're pretty much not gonna overdose and all. But I just wanted to say safe supply for a drinker is taking a pill, so it blocks receptors, is, I think. But for so many people, like, to take a pill, if you're used to smoking drugs or injecting, for so many people, the preparation, of getting it ready to do it is the hype. So how, I'm just to me, understanding of, now that I know a little bit more about safe supply, that's kind of what I thought it was, like going to a doctor and getting a pill and it blocks your, but like for so many, like I said, it's the hype of getting everything ready, or, you know, smoking it or injecting it. I just, something I wanted to put out there.
Thanks so much. I think that that's why time and time again, we keep going back to the importance of peer-led, drug user-led safe supply, rather than this medical model that totally disenfranchises people from their own bodily knowledge, right? About what works for them and why it works for them. Vince, you had something that you wanted to add. Please go ahead.
Yeah, it was just I wanted to address a question in the chat quickly, but I do want to say, yeah, Delilah, it's exactly right. So, you know the Jetsons, like in the, like they have instead of food, they have the little pill that's supposed to taste like a steak. It's not the same, folks, right? You gotta have the steak. And so in the same way, safe supply, if they're only giving out dillies or patches, it's not the same as injecting the social aspect of drugs, right? That we can't deny. And the question I wanted to address in the chat is like, what's going to happen with dealers, right? So I think this is really important, as Caitlin said all the way at the top of this, is that it's a slippery slope, right? Once we start to, again, like solidify who is and who isn't a criminal because of all these kind of like weird matrices that they arbitrarily decide, again, it opens up a lot of space for discretion still, right? Again, if a cop, you might have under the amounts, but if you're holding a scale, right? This happened to a former president, Simona, right? She was holding a scale, and that's where they're like, you're a dealer, right? You're a dealer, you gotta go to jail. Simona just likes weighing things sometimes, right? But I think that this is an important, it begs us the question, what's the difference between a dealer and a user? Again, these are moral categories, right? Of course, there's like, the big scary dealers that you watch on Netflix, but if you're on the ground, people deal to each other all the time. They're passing each other medicine when they need it, right? And maybe they exchange a few bucks. This was the whole reason the college was, supposedly taking away dillies and carries from people, is because they're passing it to each other, right? Which should be the end effect of safe supply, is that it goes into the community. People are making a couple of bucks, right? The price of dillies went down from like $10 a pop to $1, right? And people can make extra bucks because they have extra ones, and people get the safe, clean supply. But they just couldn't handle that, again, because they want to monopolize the power and the money of distributing the drugs, right? If it weren't for dillies being on the streets, I wouldn't be able to like live through COVID. I have a dilly right here, and I was able to go through COVID. I'm not saying it dillies cure COVID, but I will say it made it a lot easier to have COVID because I was able, through the community, get some of these tiny little pills, right? Anyway, so that's all I wanted to say on the questions in the chat.
Thanks, Vince. I'm just like, again, seeing a couple of threads that I want to pull out from the chat. Some really important points from Carrie in so-called Nanaimo, talking about like where there's shortfalls for like more rural communities, the importance of working with those folks around allowing people to pick their preferred blend of substances. Sounds lovely. I don't know, like that's how a lot of people procure stimulants like coffee. They have a brand that they want to get and it's not a big deal, and you can get some hipster artisanal shit, or you can get the like vacuum sealed pack, whatever you like. We are sort of moving towards the end of this panel, and I want to highlight something that I think is a pretty big question, which is there are communities that I think are being left out of like decrim conversations and safe supply, and it's not unusual or atypical. Anyone who's on this call who's part of drug policy world knows it's very white, it's very academic. It is not particularly attentive to the needs of youth or young people who are using drugs. And so I want to just hear from folks like, who do you think we really need to consider and center as we're thinking through decriminalization and safe supply? And who are you worried might get forgotten? So it's a tough question. I'll give you a second to sit with it. Jeremy, looks like you have an answer.
I mean, yeah, I think what you really need to consider is I mean, and this is just, I'm just pulling from my kind of public health expertise, but look at where, substance use intersects with other kind of popular, I mean, marginalized is probably not the right word, but, other populations who really need some liberation and are being kind of oppressed by the system. So, you're talking, indigenous populations, sex workers, youth for sure. And there's so many, but what is really kind of at the crux of it is that for any liberation movement to be successful, you need to work at empowering the most sort of disempowered subsect of your movement, and that's where you really start to build a powerful movement, is when you take care of those who need the most. And to name every single kind of group who's being excluded, I'm sure the list goes on and on and on, but that's really it. You need to take a really critical look and make sure that your tables are inclusive of the people who are not there. So take inventory of who's there and who is not, and making sure that it's inclusive.
Thanks, Jeremy. Delilah, do you have any thoughts you want to add in about who needs to be at the table when we're talking about decrim?
Well, who needs to be at the table, I think, would be like the really small communities, where they still have substance users, but yet a lot of they don't want it on their community, like, the elders or people who don't really use, but they're still there, they're in the closet, so to speak, using drugs and even harm reduction gear. A lot of the communities don't have it, they don't want it, but yet there's still users in there. And it's like, how would you approach them to say, hey, look, help your community, help your people, but yet they don't want that, but there's so much trauma that happens. And a lot of addiction stems from trauma from when you're really, really young or anything like that. And the only way to cope half the time is to use or drink, right? And it's really sad, to hear that the suicide rates on small communities, right? I mean, I was saying to a lady that I worked for before that if I could, I would drive to these different small communities and give harm reduction or safe supply if I could, right? Be something, but my broom doesn't hold that much stuff. But in the same sense, that's something, I'd be looking into doing, right? But then I would like to keep myself safe. If you have an understanding of what I'm saying, I'd need to keep myself safe, but yet I'd like to help the small communities because they matter lots, right? And that's who seems to be forgotten a lot about.
Thanks for that, Delilah. Vince, over to you. Who do you think needs to be at the table that isn't right now?
Well, I think Jeremy and Delilah made a good point. I do want to make maybe it's to kind of scoop around the question a bit, is that policy isn't the end. I like this is a policy conversation, but really policy follows power, right? And power comes in a lot of places, and especially the community. And so I really want to focus in on this one issue, because I know there's a lot of young people here, a lot of youths. I'm no longer one, I guess, but there's a lot of people that want to change how just this horrific system that's killing people every day, right? But we have to consider that even in Vancouver, where there's all this harm reduction, infrastructure and institutions that came out of Vandu's work, overdose deaths are still spiking, right? And so that's a clue that there's something bigger here, right? Because if we just focus in on drug policy and just let's give more money to VCH, right, to put more pipes on the ground, it still hasn't changed anything in terms of the amount of death that we see every day. And that's why Vandu, to learn from its legacy, that we've always seen drug policy as just one piece of the bigger puzzle around housing, around policing, welfare, colonialism, the daily violence that people experience on downtown East Side. We must struggle against it at every angle all the time, right? And that's why I think it's important to reframe progressive drug policy to what do we do to fight this drug war, right? And before Meenakshi says that this is macho bullshit, I want to say that because this is a war. It's killing people every day. The state and its colonial laws, its enclosures, its police actions murder people every day. And so we have to understand the stakes of this, because there's so many people who have slummed it at Vandu for a couple of years and made their names off of oh yeah, now I'm a big drug policy analyst. Oh, I'm an expert. I'm a UBC prof now, right? And they pop out of the neighborhood afterwards. And good for them, right? They helped a little bit on this one policy. But how about the countless lives, the countless hours of organizing that went into that? The people who will never have their name behind the Vancouver model, will never be paid thousands of dollars to do a lecture circuit on how they helped develop decriminalization policy. For people to understand, we must struggle every day in the community, and that you don't need to be an expert in anything for that, right? You just need to show up and be there, right? And be there for the community, struggle with and against and all against all, it's a hard time at Vandy sometimes, but we learn to love each other through this work. And that's the work. It's the daily survival and attempts to flourish and love each other, and really just stick together in the downtown east side. That's what pushes what will one day become policy, right? That comes way later, right? And the counselors and the cops get to put their names on it. But again, the struggle is on the streets, right? That's what I want to leave people with.
Thanks for that, Vince. And I think for folks who are maybe new to this conversation, not just this one tonight, but to this broader conversation and fight against the drug war, it is important to understand that gaining power is not just about sitting at policy tables or representation. And I mean, I've seen that happen time and time again. We see tokenized folks who sit at a table, and government, lawmakers, police think that immunizes them against critique, right? But, again, I really appreciate you refocusing that building power in the community through mutual aid, through solidarity, through fighting the police on the block, through supporting your peers and your loved ones is what's actually going to drive change. And at the end of the day, that's what's saving lives, right? That's the work that each of you is doing that is actually saving lives. Caitlin, if there's anything that you want to add in, particularly around youth and their exclusion from Decrim right now, that would be really great.
Sure, yeah. Also, thanks everyone for your answers to that question. Yeah, so often in speaking about drug policy, policymakers and government leave out youth. And I was having this conversation with someone recently about the fact that youth are governed under a different piece of legislation, like the Youth Criminal Justice Act, gives government an excuse to not engage with it, and to sort of say, that's under a different legal umbrella. We're not going there. That's what happened in Vancouver, and that's also what happened in BC with their application exemptions. And it completely reveals the fact that the government doesn't actually believe that prohibition is harmful, because if they did, they'd recognize that it's harmful to everyone, regardless of whether you're 16, 17, 18, or however old. And so, I think it's becoming increasingly noticeable that at these tables, youth are not invited, and they're absent because we're mostly talking about policies that exclude youth. And that's extremely dangerous, especially in BC, when we're existing under an NDP government whose response to youth who use drugs has been to draft legislation that would involuntarily detain them and coercively medicalize them. And that's a bill that, has kind of is sitting on the back burner at this time, but threatens to come back at any time. And it just has gone completely sort of unacknowledged by the NDP government about being progressive on drug policy, and yet at the same time being going out of their way to draft legislation that will harm youth who use substances. So I think, youth have to be at the table, and increasingly those folks in this panel and who are tuned into this conversation, when you do have opportunity to sit at tables and talk about drug policy, to ensure that youth are there too, to make your involvement contingent on youth involvement and presence at the table as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Caitlin. There's a great article that was just shared in the chat, an op-ed written by Coalition of Peers Dismantling the Drug War and the Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy Vancouver chapter that says drug decriminalization without youth is not decriminalization. And also maybe decriminalization that has 4 syllables isn't like the best model either. And we need to simplify, because I'm like stumbling over all of this language tonight. So we're in the last piece of the discussion. And again, thank you so much to everyone who's here, and especially folks who are engaging in the chat. Please know that I'm seeing your questions, and I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of your points tonight. But there's many, many ways to continue engaging beyond this panel. I'm just going to go to each of you for your closing thoughts as we wrap up, and ask, what advice can you give to other communities who want to work towards drug decriminalization? And Caitlin, if it's okay, if I start with you, that would be awesome.
Sure. Well, given that a lot of folks who are tuned in tonight might be students, or I know some of you are law students, I think just always keeping in mind that any sort of policy work or advocacy or legal strategy is worth very little when it's not accompanied by a movement and backed by a movement. You cannot work toward those kinds of changes unilaterally. And that's true not just for the benefit of the community, but true for you as an individual as well. Everything is more fulfilling when we're struggling together in this. And that's kind of the only thing that's going to sustain us all in whatever area of work we find ourselves. That's what's going to keep our motivation and movement alive. Oh, and also just want to note, it's the 1-year death of a very good friend of many of us on this panel, Ron Kay, member of Vandu and fierce drug policy advocate, incredible human being. So much love to him. He would be here tonight. He is here tonight. And he's super alive and well in our hearts, and we love you so much, Ron. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Caitlin. Vince, I'm going to go to you now. If you could just share what advice you give to other communities who want to work towards decrim.
Sorry, yeah, no, just I miss Ron very much. So, I mean, every community needs a Vandu. Every community needs a Dolph. We need a Vandu and Dolph in every fucking city, in this so-called Canada. And yeah, I want to go off of what Caitlin was saying, right? Like, quit law school. But for those of you that can't, just remember, right, is that the power is always lies in the community, and struggle is everywhere, right? And living and learning with people in struggle, you realize it's just like, it's all connected, all of it, right? There's this idea, especially in Vancouver, this mythologizing of the violence in the downtown east side that's like separate from like the rest of like normal Vancouver, right? And that's just the crazy downtown east side. But that membrane is really thin, right? And you learn this stuff if you actually do the community work. Like I work with the tenants union, and there's so many like seniors who are just left alone, who are renting in like little tiny apartments that are still cheap because they've been there for so long, and thus they're preyed upon by real estate developers and landlords. And once they get evicted, where do you think they end up, right? So many people that I've worked with have just disappeared into downtown east side, and people forget that we share this city, we share this space, and we're like, it's one system. It's the same shitty landlords, the same stupid counselors, the same beat cops that circulate through the city. I was gonna make a joke earlier with Meenakshi. It's just that, like, the cops are way more intersectional than you think, because they have their fingers in every part of society. That's what we learned through this whole Decrim thing, right? Is that you think that cops are the guys just like with the guns on the streets. No, they sit on every fucking policy board, panel, working group, all across the city, health, housing, welfare, all of it, right? We need them out, right? And we must fight them at every moment, struggle against them, push them out of our society. Because they are the ones, right? They're the ones killing people, folks. And when you leave decriminalization in the hands of Chief Palmer, what the fuck do you think you're gonna get? I think that's my final statement, is that remember, folks, the struggle is ever. You don't need to be a lawyer to do this work. I have like 0 credentials, and yet Delilah trusts me to work at Vandu, right? And it's because I stuck around, I guess. and I love everyone at Vandu for that. And I'm honored to be on this panel with everyone here. That's it.
Thanks. And I know we're invoking some of our folks who have fallen to the drug war, and I just want to note we will have a moment at the end, because I think they absolutely are all here with us. They're teaching us long after we think that they're gone from their earthly presence. Jeremy, I'm wondering if you could share what advice you would give to other communities wanting to work towards decrim, and then we're going to close with thoughts from Delilah.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think I'll try to keep it short. The main thing is, change happens through action and movement building. So if you got groups in your community who are already kind of plugged into this, find ways to support them to take action. And I think a lot of people get a hold of Dolph and they're like, oh, we want to do what you're doing, and obviously it comes with a lot of risk, and a lot of people aren't willing to kind of take those risks. But there are other things you can do, because really what it comes down to is creating kind of these like things that people can talk about and observe. So for example, like when overdose prevention sites were illegal and people were getting them started, like some people would start overdose prevention sites and other people would create mock overdose prevention sites. And if people wanted to do mock kind of Dolph distributions and really kind of show, like, if they aren't willing to take that risk, and I don't blame you, it sucks, but if they wanted to show at events, if there's overdose awareness days, like set up a mock like safe supply distribution site. Be like, if people knew what they were taking and shit can look like this, like that's like really important, and it creates those conversations and awareness of what safe supply really is. And yeah, change isn't gonna happen working with the city or working with these policy people. It will never work. The first opportunity they have to boot you out or boot a dissenting voice out, they will take it. Kind of case in point, recent developments. But that's the reality of it. The policymakers, the institutions, the state don't want us there. And if you become a threat, they'll find a way to get you out right away. So that's all I have to say. And thanks.
Thanks, Jeremy. Delilah, over to you for your closing thoughts on what you would tell people who want to support Decrim in their community.
If you can get a hold of somebody that can get a hold of somebody here in Vancouver at Vandu, just be open, hopefully you can be open and willing to change. Yeah, and 1 year already, wow. And Vince, I'm going to give you a great big hug, because I know how close you and Ron were, and I miss that goofy guy and his goofy ways and his goofy laugh, and half the time I just wanted to give him one of those, but and I do miss him, and it's hard to believe that how things went, and we found out he was, guys, I just couldn't believe it, right? It's just, yeah. So yeah, just thank you to everybody. It's been really awesome. When I first got here, I was a little out of sorts, and I came in late, and I was like, I'm not in that, right? So, but yeah, I seem to have calmed myself down a bit, and you guys really helped me with that. And right on to Dolph and Jeremy and you guys for really pushing for all this exemption, right? Because we really need it, right? you know, pretty sure the governments and the police now are going to be pissed off because they're not going to be making the money or getting the free drugs from the people anymore, right? If we go through with that, because that's their biggest thing. People, you know, they rob the people. They'll take their drugs and their money, but they won't get a thing to say when they got to go to court, and they go there like, oh, well, we don't know nothing about that. There's no nothing here about it. Go figure, right? But yeah, thanks to everybody. And yeah, you guys, and Caitlin, thanks for being there for us. And Vince, you're right for the job, and we're so grateful you're here, and I'm glad you stuck around. And I still have pictures of the cake when you first got here at Vandu. Love you guys. Be safe out there.
Thank you so much, Delilah. I just want to end tonight's panel by recognizing the work that each of these folks are doing. Jeremy, Vince, Delilah, and Caitlin, thank you for joining and for sharing your expertise. I also want to give credit to the organizers, folks from CSSDP and Law Students for Decrim. Thank you so much for bringing this panel together, for all of the work that you've done behind the scenes, folks who are moderating the chat, doing tech, fielding emails, sending out last minute links. And I think it's really reflected in the audience that came out, folks from across so-called Canada and someone from Austria.
Wow.
Welcome, that's a treat. So yeah, it's been a real honor to moderate, and I thank you all for letting me do that.
Thank you for moderating.
Yeah, thank you, Menage. We love you, Menage.
Yes, we do.
Menage rules.
Just a reminder that the recording will be made available after the event. Follow all of these groups in the different ways you do, and maybe that just means you're giving them money so that they can do the work they're doing until you start your own chapter. So I'm just gonna ask Delilah if she wouldn't mind leading the moment of silence before we close out tonight. And sharing a little bit about.
You twisted my arm.
Thanks, Delilah.
I would take off my hat, but I'm having a really bad hair day, and then you guys would all see my wisdom highlights, which isn't many, but you know. It's a tradition at a lot of the meetings that I go to, especially at Vandu and Wars and all the other meetings, that we hold a moment of silence for the people that are struggling, the missing and murdered women, girls, and even the men out there, to all the families of all the babies that were found. People in bad relationships and those with just daily struggles. I mean, if you want to say some names now, that would be great, and then we could take a moment of silence. Let this moment be for them. All my relations. Keep up the good work, everybody. You're awesome.
Thanks, Delilah, and good night, everyone. And thanks to folks who joined this evening's panel.
Thanks, Delilah.
Right on, guys.
See you tomorrow. Oh.
Yeah, you're getting a big squeeze.
Love you guys.
Everyone, thank you.